No one from my family showed up at my wedding. Not my mom, not my dad, not my sister. The 5 seats I had reserved for them in the front row, each marked with a delicate white card bearing their names, stayed empty as the ceremony began. The music swelled, the guests stood, and I smiled, pretending everything was fine. My hands were steady, my face calm under the lace veil, but inside something was unraveling. When I walked back down the aisle with Ethan, my new husband, people clapped, threw rose petals, and shouted, "Congratulations." I held his hand tighter than I should have. Then my phone, tucked inside my bouquet, started buzzing. Once, twice, then again. I glanced down. Mom calling. Then Dad, then Sophie. By the time we reached the car, there were 40 missed calls and one message flashing on the screen. "Come home. Now, it's about Sophie." The sky above Charleston was painted pink and gold, the kind of beauty people plan weddings around. But all I could see was the empty row of seats that should have held my family. The string quartet played the soft melody of "Can't Help Falling in Love," and yet the only sound echoing in my head was my mother's last text from the night before. "We might be running late, sweetheart. Don't worry." I had believed her, just as I always had, because even after a lifetime of disappointment, a small part of me still wanted to believe that they cared. I had chosen this riverside venue carefully, a restored wooden boathouse surrounded by oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Ethan and I paid for everything ourselves, the catering, the flowers, even the twinkle lights strung over the dance floor. My parents had promised to cover the photographer. That check never arrived. When I first told them we were getting married, my mom's response was, "Oh, that's nice, honey. When is Sophie's birthday trip again?" I should have taken that as a sign, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that maybe, just maybe, they'd show up and surprise me. As the ceremony went on, I kept stealing glances toward those 5 empty chairs. Each one felt like a wound. Ethan's parents sat 2 rows behind them, whispering softly to each other, their eyes flickering toward me with pity. I couldn't blame them. They had raised their son to value loyalty, kindness, and family. Meanwhile, I had grown up in a house where love was conditional, something you earned by being loud enough, charming enough, or beautiful enough. Things my sister Sophie excelled at. When the officiant announced, "You may kiss the bride," I leaned in, my smile trembling at the corners. The guests cheered. Someone popped a champagne bottle, but in my chest the silence was deafening. I had imagined this day so many times, my father walking me down the aisle, my mother crying happy tears, Sophie teasing me about my makeup. I had pictured family photos, laughter, maybe even forgiveness. Instead, there was a hollow space where all of that should have been. After the ceremony, I escaped to the bridal suite. My white gown pooled around my feet, heavy and perfect. The air smelled like roses and champagne, but I couldn't taste joy. I picked up my phone from the vanity, ready to text my mother, ready to ask, "Where are you?" But before I could type a word, a notification appeared on the top of the screen. Sophie's Instagram story. A picture of her at a Florida resort, sunglasses, cocktail in hand, ocean glittering behind her. The caption read, "Birthday trip with mom and dad, family time," 3 heart emojis. My hands went cold. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The same family that couldn't find time to attend my wedding had flown to the beach for a last-minute birthday trip. My mother's excuse, "something urgent came up," suddenly made sense. Urgent meant a luxury suite by the ocean, not her daughter's wedding. I felt my throat tighten, my stomach twist. I pressed the phone to my chest and whispered, "Of course they did." It wasn't new. Sophie had always been the golden child, the one who drew all the light in every room. Even when we were little, she could do no wrong. She'd break something and I'd be the one blamed. She'd get a C in math and mom would laugh it off. "Not everyone needs numbers, sweetheart." I got straight A's, but my parents rarely noticed. They said I was the quiet one, the responsible one, as if those words were compliments. They weren't. They were labels, a way to say I wasn't special enough to deserve attention. As I sat there watching likes pour into Sophie's vacation post, a memory flickered in my mind. My high school graduation. I had walked across the stage alone then too. My parents had missed that ceremony because they didn't want Sophie to be bored waiting. They took her to a theme park instead. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. That one day when it really counted, they'd be there. And yet here I was in a wedding dress, reliving the same story. Ethan knocked softly and peeked in. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was gentle, steady. I smiled, forcing my voice not to crack. "Yeah, just a little tired." He didn't press. He never did. Maybe that's why I fell in love with him. He never made me feel like I had to perform. When he left to greet the guests, I turned back to the mirror. My reflection looked flawless, but my eyes betrayed me. Behind the perfect curls and painted lips was a woman who still craved her parents' approval. A woman who kept getting left behind. I gathered my things, slipped out into the hallway, and joined the reception. Friends hugged me, handed me gifts, took photos. "You look beautiful, Claire," they said. "Where's your family?" someone asked quietly. I just smiled. They couldn't make it. The words tasted bitter, but they came out smooth. Years of practice. I danced, laughed, and made small talk. But every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. By the end of the night, as guests began to leave, and the music faded, I finally checked my messages. 39 missed calls. Then a 40th one came in before I could breathe. Mom calling. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't answer. Another vibration followed, this time a text. "Come home. Now. It's about Sophie." I froze. My heart pounded. The words felt heavy, ominous. Something about them didn't fit the usual pattern of panic over Sophie's drama. I had seen enough of those to recognize the tone. This one was different. Short. Desperate. My chest tightened as if my body already knew what my mind refused to imagine. The night air outside was warm and still. Fireflies blinked near the trees. Ethan came up beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. I showed him the phone. He frowned. "Do you want to call her?" I shook my head. "Not yet." Because deep down, a strange calm had settled over me like the air right before a storm. My whole life I had watched Sophie's chaos go unchecked, her mistakes swept under the rug while I played the quiet, responsible one. But something in my gut told me this time it wouldn't be swept away. This time, whatever had happened to Sophie was big enough that even my parents couldn't hide it. As we drove away from the venue, the phone lit up again and again. Calls. Messages. Missed FaceTimes. I silenced it and leaned my head against the window. The city lights of Charleston blurred into streaks of gold. I didn't know yet what waited at the end of those calls. But for the first time, I didn't rush to answer. I just whispered to myself, whatever it is, they'll finally see what happens when you abandon the wrong daughter. That night, when I finally set the phone face down on the nightstand, the silence felt heavier than ever. I stared at the ceiling, my wedding dress draped across the chair, and thought of the empty seats, the birthday trip, the 40 missed calls. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But somewhere, buried under the ache, a quiet voice whispered the truth. I'd been too afraid to hear all my life the family I longed for never truly existed. The morning light crept through the curtains, brushing against the edge of my wedding gown that still hung by the closet. The bouquet from last night had already begun to wilt, its white roses fading to ivory. My phone sat on the nightstand, its screen dim but covered in notifications, 40 missed calls, 12 unread messages, all from my mother. I didn't open a single one. Ethan was still asleep beside me, his hand resting gently on my arm. For a moment I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint hum of the ceiling fan, wondering how something as beautiful as a wedding could leave me feeling so completely hollow. The smell of flowers drifted from the kitchen, a reminder of my mother's old shop back home, the one place that had taught me what it meant to be both needed and unseen. I walked barefoot across the wooden floor, still in my robe, and for a moment I wasn't 29, newly married, or living in Charleston. I was 10 years old again, standing behind the counter at Evans Floral, clutching a handful of stems while my mother called out, "Sophie, sweetheart, show them your smile." Our mother Linda had always said Sophie was born to be seen. Even as a child, she had the kind of beauty that made strangers stop and coo. Blonde curls, dimpled cheeks, a laugh that filled the whole shop. I was quieter, darker-haired, and always busy trying to make myself useful. While Mom showed Sophie off to the customers, I was the one trimming stems, wiping the counters, tying ribbons on bouquets. When one customer once complimented my arrangement, "That's lovely, you have a real eye for design," my mother had smiled and said, "Oh, Claire's just helping out. Sophie's the creative one in the family." I learned early that silence was safer than trying to compete. Every praise aimed at Sophie seemed to echo louder, every glance toward me dimmed by comparison. Even our father Paul, who I once believed was the more even-tempered parent, fell into the pattern. "Be patient with your sister," he'd tell me when Sophie threw a tantrum. "You're the older one." That phrase followed me everywhere like a chain. "You're the older one." It was both instruction and warning. Don't expect too much, don't make a fuss, don't need. The smell of lilies in the apartment kitchen made my stomach twist. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. The phone was still on the table, silent now. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to call home. Instead, I let my mind drift back to another day that had once broken me quietly. I was 10 when I won my first spelling bee. The trophy was plastic, the medal thin and cheap, but I had memorized every word in that thick dictionary for weeks. The ceremony was the same weekend Sophie entered a children's beauty pageant. I begged my parents to come to the competition hall to see me walk on stage and spell encyclopedia in front of the judges. Mom smiled, patted my cheek, and said, "Sweetheart, your dad and I promised Sophie we'd be there. You're such a smart girl, you don't need us to hold your hand." That Saturday, I stood on the stage with my heart pounding, scanning the crowd for their faces. Every seat was filled with cheering parents, bouquets, banners, but none of them were mine. I held my certificate in both hands, waiting for someone to notice. When I got home later, still wearing my medal, I found them in the living room clapping as Sophie twirled in her glittering dress. She'd come in second place. Dad lifted her into his arms and said, "We're so proud of you, our star." I had stood in the doorway, medal glinting under the yellow light. No one asked how I'd done. I learned not to bring it up. The years went on like that. Every moment I tried to shine, Sophie's light would swallow mine. When I was 15, I got invited to the spring dance by a boy from my chemistry class. I ran to tell Mom, hoping for excitement, but she only sighed. "That's nice, honey, but we can't afford a new dress right now. Sophie's recital is next week." The night of the dance, I stayed home doing algebra homework while Sophie showed off a brand new pink dress she'd wear on stage. At 16, I got my driver's permit the same day Sophie made the local newspaper for winning a youth art contest. Guess which story was framed on the living room wall? And yet I never stopped trying to earn their love. I thought maybe if I worked hard enough, if I stayed responsible enough, they'd notice. So I studied relentlessly, graduated top of my class, and got a full scholarship to the University of Georgia. When I brought home my acceptance letter, my dad's first words were, "That's great, Claire. It'll save us a lot of money." A week later, Sophie announced she wanted to go to art school in Florida. They threw her a backyard party. Balloons, cake, new luggage. I remember standing at that party, holding a paper plate with half a slice of cake, listening to my mother tell the neighbors, "Sophie's so brave, following her dreams, not one person mentioned mine." By then I had started working part-time at a diner to afford dorm supplies. I told myself it didn't matter, that independence was its own reward. But at night, lying in my narrow dorm bed, I used to wonder what it would feel like to be the one everyone celebrated even just once. The first time I realized how deep the favoritism went was during my junior year. Sophie failed a class at her art school, and my parents panicked about losing their tuition loan. My mother called me late one night crying, "You're good with numbers, honey. Can you help us figure out how to refinance?" I spent hours helping them file the paperwork, adjusting their budget, saving Sophie's semester. Not once did they say thank you. The next week, my mom posted a photo online of Sophie smiling under palm trees with the caption, "So proud of our little artist." That night, I deleted the photo before it finished loading. I didn't need more proof. I already knew. I took another sip of coffee, staring at the quiet street outside my window. Ethan had left for an early meeting, leaving me alone with the soft hum of traffic and the ache of memory. I reached for my phone again, opening the last message from my mother before the wedding. "We'll be there, sweetheart. Wouldn't miss it for the world." I scrolled up through the thread, seeing months of half-hearted responses, broken promises, and long silences. "Proud of you, honey," she'd written when I sent her photos of the wedding invitations. "Remind me what date again now?" At the top of the thread glared the latest message, "Come home. Now it's about Sophie." I tossed the phone aside and leaned back in my chair. It was always about Sophie. Every crisis, every tear, every family meeting somehow circled back to her. When she got a speeding ticket, I was the one asked to pay it. When she maxed out her first credit card, I helped her make a repayment plan. When she got engaged to Ryan, a man who wore expensive suits and promised investment opportunities, I was the one my father called for financial advice. "He's in real estate," he'd said proudly, "smart like you." I had looked him up online. Ryan's record was spotless then. Clean, charming, ambitious. But there had been something about his smile in those photos that made my stomach twist, something too polished, too easy. I told my mother, "Just be careful with him." She laughed. "Don't be jealous, Claire. Sophie finally found someone who can keep up with her." Jealous. The word hit like a slap even now. I stood walking toward the small vase of fading roses. Their petals had begun to curl at the edges, bruised from too much handling. I pulled one free and pressed it between my fingers. Maybe love was like that, beautiful at first, but fragile, destined to wilt when neglected. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but awareness. A quiet understanding that the pattern I'd lived in wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. I had spent decades trying to be the dependable one, the fixer, the rescuer. And what had it earned me? An empty row at my own wedding. I walked to the bedroom, set the rose down on the nightstand, and whispered to myself, "No more." Then just as I sat down, my phone buzzed again, not a call this time, but a news alert. My eyes skimmed the headline, "Federal investigation underway into real estate fraud tied to luxury Florida resorts." My heart stilled as I read the name of the resort, Key Largo Shoreline. The same resort tagged in Sophie's Instagram story. I stared at the screen, pulse quickening. The article was brief, mentioning multiple arrests expected in the coming days, and one company under immediate scrutiny, Hale and Partners Investments. Ryan's company. I didn't move for a long time. Outside, a seagull cried somewhere near the harbor, its sound sharp against the quiet morning. My coffee had gone cold. The petals from the rose lay scattered across the table like small bruises. For the first time since my wedding, I felt something other than hurt. I felt the slow, deliberate turn of inevitability. Whatever storm had started brewing around Sophie and my parents, it was coming fast. And for once I didn't plan to step in and save them. 2 weeks before my wedding, Charleston felt like it was holding its breath. The city smelled of salt and jasmine, the air warm and thick, and every sunset turned the harbor gold. I spent my mornings finalizing seating charts, tasting cakes, and confirming the band. I wanted everything to be perfect, not extravagant, not showy, just beautiful, in a way that felt honest. Ethan laughed when he saw me rewriting the place cards for the 3rd time. "You've got to stop," he said, kissing the top of my head. "They'll love it either way." They meant my parents. And my sister. I wanted to believe that. Mom had promised they'd come. She said it so casually that I didn't even question it. "Of course, sweetheart," she told me over the phone, her voice full of warmth that almost sounded real. "Your father and I wouldn't miss it. Sophie's been under stress with Ryan's business lately, but we'll manage." That should have been my first warning, the way Sophie was always woven into every sentence about me. But I ignored the unease and focused on the tiny details: the pale blue napkins, the wildflowers in mason jars, the soft jazz playlist Ethan had made. I imagined my mother's face lighting up when she saw the floral arch, the one I'd built myself with hydrangeas and peonies. I imagined Sophie laughing, teasing me about crying during my vows. But it didn't happen that way. The week before the wedding, I started to feel it, the distance. Mom's messages became shorter, her tone distracted. Dad didn't call at all. I texted them a photo of the final fitting, me standing in front of a mirror in a simple lace gown. "You look beautiful, honey," Mom replied an hour later, followed by, "We'll talk soon." Soon never came. 3 days before the wedding, she finally called. I remember the time, exactly 7:23 in the evening. I was sitting on the porch stringing fairy lights while Ethan grilled dinner. When I saw her name flash on the screen, my heart leapt. "Hi, Mom," I said, cheerful, expecting to hear excitement in her voice. Instead, there was a sigh. "Sweetheart, about the wedding?" My stomach dropped. "What about it?" "Well, your sister isn't feeling well," she began. "She's been having terrible migraines, and Ryan thinks the sea air might help her relax. We were thinking of taking her to Florida for a few days." I froze, the string of lights dangling from my fingers. "Florida? The wedding is this weekend." "I know, honey, and we're so proud of you. We'll still send a beautiful gift. You understand, don't you? Sophie's been so anxious." I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. "You can't come because Sophie needs a vacation." "Don't say it like that," she said sharply. "Family takes care of each other. You've always been the strong one." I didn't answer. I just stared at the twinkling lights in my hands, feeling my chest tighten. She ended the call with her usual line, "We'll make it up to you later." When I told Ethan, he stopped what he was doing and set down the tongs. "Claire," he said softly, "they're not coming, are they?" I shook my head. "No, they're not." He reached out and pulled me into his arms. "Then we'll make our own family that day. You and me, that's all we need." I smiled, but my throat burned. "I know." But I still wanted my dad to walk me down the aisle. He pressed a kiss to my forehead. "Then I'll walk beside you. We'll do it our way." The night before the wedding, I was folding the last of the favors when my phone buzzed again. A text from Sophie. "Don't be mad, sis. We're going on a last-minute trip to Florida for my birthday. Ryan says I need a break. I'll FaceTime you from the beach, promise." There was a photo attached her, and Ryan clinking champagne glasses on a private jet. My parents tagged in the comments with heart emojis. I stared at the screen until the image blurred. Then I typed back, "Have fun, happy birthday." No more words, no accusation. Just the same silence I'd carried all my life. The morning of the wedding came bright and cloudless. Sunlight streamed through the curtains and Charleston Harbor shimmered in the distance. My best friend Julia arrived early with coffee and croissants. "You ready?" she asked, her eyes lighting up when she saw me in my robe. "As ready as I'll ever be," the makeup artist hummed softly as she worked. When I looked in the mirror, I saw calmness, too much calmness. No one would have guessed my family wasn't coming. I checked my phone one last time. No new messages, no calls. Meanwhile, somewhere hundreds of miles away, my parents were tagging Sophie in another post. "Breakfast by the pool. Family time." At the venue, the air was thick with the scent of roses and salt water. The guests began to arrive. Ethan's family, my coworkers, a few old friends from college. I smiled, greeted them, thanked them for coming. I didn't let anyone see the ache in my chest. When the music began, I stepped out into the sunlight. The aisle stretched before me, covered in petals. The officiant asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" No one spoke. Ethan stepped forward, took my hand, and smiled. "We do." The crowd laughed softly. The sound was gentle healing in its own way. Still, when I glanced at the front row, the 5 seats marked family were empty. Each chair gleamed white against the green grass, a small reminder of everything I had done to earn a place that was never mine. I swallowed hard and looked straight ahead. I wasn't going to let them steal this moment too. After the ceremony, the reception glowed with string lights and laughter. Ethan's parents hugged me, his mother whispering, "You're beautiful, darling. We're lucky to have you." I nearly cried at those words. It was the first time a mother had ever said something like that to me. When the dancing started, I slipped away to the bridal suite. My phone buzzed on the vanity, one new message from Mom. "Sweetheart, we're so proud of you. Can't wait to see photos." A minute later, Sophie's post appeared in my feed, her standing on a yacht, wind blowing through her hair, captioned, "Best birthday ever. I love my family so much." Underneath, both my parents had commented heart emojis. That was the moment something inside me cracked open. Not in the loud, dramatic way pain usually does, but in silence, like the slow splitting of glass. They hadn't missed my wedding by accident. They hadn't been torn between two choices. They had chosen her. Again. I turned off the phone, set it face down, and sat on the edge of the bed. From the dance floor below, laughter drifted up through the open window. I could hear Ethan's voice mingling with the music. For the first time, I realized that family could sound like that, warm, unforced, real. Julia peeked in a few minutes later, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Everything okay?" I nodded, taking the glass. "Perfect," I lied. When she left, I raised my drink to the empty air. "To the family I used to chase," I whispered and took a long sip. Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the candles had burned low, Ethan and I returned to our apartment. I showered, wiped the makeup from my face, and crawled into bed. The city was quiet outside, only the hum of cars along the waterfront. I picked up my phone to silence it, but a new alert flashed across the screen. Breaking news: federal authorities investigating South Florida real estate fraud. Multiple arrests expected. Sources name Hale and Partners Investments among companies under review. I blinked. Hale and Partners, Ryan's company. For a second I thought it was some kind of coincidence. But then I remembered the logo on the yacht in Sophie's post earlier that day, the same sleek H&P insignia printed on the hull. I sat up, staring at the screen as my heartbeat quickened. The article mentioned an ongoing investigation, the FBI tracking fraudulent property deals linked to luxury resorts. One name repeated over and over: Key Largo Shoreline, the same resort where my parents had taken Sophie for her birthday trip. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the harbor and the faint ping of incoming messages I didn't open. I could feel it, a storm forming miles away but coming closer with every breath. By morning the news would break wide open, and the family who couldn't be bothered to attend my wedding would find themselves at the center of a scandal that would strip away everything they thought they could control. And for once, I wouldn't be the one cleaning up their mess. The city was quiet when we left the venue, the streets slick with humidity and the faint smell of rain drifting in from the harbor. I sat in the back seat of Ethan's car, still wearing my gown, my fingers tracing the pearls stitched into the sleeve. The laughter from the reception echoed faintly in my ears, fading with every block we passed. For the first time all day, I let the silence settle over me. No music, no chatter, no pretense, just the hum of the tires on the road and the soft thud of my own heartbeat. Ethan reached over, brushing his thumb against my hand. "You did beautifully tonight," he said. I smiled weakly. "I just hope the pictures don't show how empty it was." He squeezed my hand. "It wasn't empty. You had everyone who truly mattered." But I couldn't answer. The truth was, the space they left behind, the 5 seats I'd saved for my family, still echoed louder than any applause. The drive home took 20 minutes. I stared out the window the whole time, watching the city lights smear into streaks of gold and blue. My phone sat in my lap, dark and still. I hadn't looked at it since the reception. I told myself I wouldn't, that I was done caring whether they texted or not. But halfway across the bridge it began to buzz. Once, then again, then again. I glanced down. Mom calling. I let it ring. It stopped, then started again. Dad, then Mom again, then Sophie. Ethan frowned. Maybe you should pick up. I shook my head, staring at the flashing screen. They had all day to call. They didn't. The phone kept vibrating louder now, like it was fighting for attention. I turned it face down, the sound muffled against the fabric of my dress. But it didn't stop. Every time I thought the calls had ended, they started again. By the time we reached home, the screen showed 40 missed calls. I sat in the parked car long after Ethan went inside, the cool air from the vent brushing against my neck. The house lights glowed softly through the windows, warm and safe, but I couldn't make myself move. I just stared at the phone, heart pounding with something between anger and dread. This wasn't new. My family only called me when something was wrong, when Sophie crashed her car, when Mom forgot to pay a bill, when Dad needed money for a temporary situation. Every time the message was the same: you're the responsible one. Fix it. I used to drop everything and go. Tonight, for the first time, I didn't. Ethan appeared at the car door, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a glass of water in his hand. You're still out here, I nodded. They won't stop calling. He handed me the water, his voice soft. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. I nodded, but deep down I knew the pattern too well. If the calls were this desperate, it wasn't something small. I set the glass down and finally picked up the phone. There was one new voicemail. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second before I pressed play. Static crackled, followed by my mother's trembling voice. Claire, please pick up, it's Sophie. Something terrible's happened. The FBI, they're here. Oh my God, they're arresting him. Ryan's being taken away. Please call me. Then silence. The message ended mid-sob. I froze. Ethan's voice drifted in from the doorway. Claire, what is it? I turned the volume up and played it again. His eyes widened as he listened. The FBI, he whispered. I nodded slowly, my hand shaking. They're at the resort, the one they went to for her birthday. I opened Sophie's Instagram. Her latest post was gone. The cheerful yacht picture replaced by a blank profile. But one story remained. A shaky video, with flashing lights, voices, shouting in the background, the faint reflection of police cars in the glass doors of a resort lobby. It didn't take long for the headlines to appear. Notifications began flooding my screen one after another. Federal raid on Key Largo Shoreline Resort, multiple arrests in real estate fraud investigation. Influencer Sophie Evans' fiancé detained for questioning. Hale and partners linked to illegal offshore accounts. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. I scrolled down, and under one of the articles a familiar face caught my eye. Sophie in tears, standing beside my mother and father outside the resort gates, surrounded by flashing lights. A reporter's caption read, "Family of detained businessman escorted out of FBI search zone." My mouth went dry. The phone buzzed again. Mom calling. I didn't answer. Then Dad. Then Sophie. When the vibration finally stopped, another voicemail appeared. This time, Mom's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Claire, they're saying Ryan's company stole money, millions maybe. We didn't know. They froze our accounts. Your father's having chest pains. Please, sweetheart, you have to help us. I sat back, staring at the dark window. For a long moment I said nothing. Then I whispered, "They're not calling because they love me. They're calling because they need me." Ethan knelt beside me. "Claire, this isn't your responsibility. They'll say, 'It is I,'" murmured. "They always do." The phone rang again. I picked it up this time. My mother's sobs filled the speaker. "Claire, thank God, please, we need you. They're asking questions about the money, about Ryan's business. We didn't know anything, I swear. Just send us something, a few thousand. We can't even check into a hotel." "Mom," I said quietly, "I told you months ago to be careful with him." Her voice rose sharp and pleading. "Claire, this isn't the time. We're family. You don't abandon family when they're suffering." Something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet click like a lock turning. "You abandoned me," I said. "At my graduation, at Christmas, at my wedding. You've been abandoning me my entire life, and now you want me to save you again. Don't be cruel, she whispered. You're better than this. No, Mom, I said softly. I'm finally just being honest. Before she could answer, I ended the call. The silence afterward was deafening. Ethan took the phone from my hand, placed it on the counter, and pulled me close. I felt his heartbeat steady against mine, grounding me. You did the right thing, he murmured. I nodded slowly, though part of me still trembled. The guilt was there, decades of conditioning telling me I was selfish if I didn't fix their mistakes. But beneath the guilt, something else was growing. Relief. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning up after them. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my wedding ring glinting under the light. All my life, I whispered, I begged for their attention. Tonight, they're begging for mine. Ethan brushed my hair back gently. And you don't owe them a thing. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the harbor. Rain began tapping against the windows, slow and steady. I picked up the phone again, not to call, but to silence it completely. A new alert flashed across the screen, news trending nationwide. Video of FBI arrest at Key Largo Resort goes viral. Family members seen crying in background, identified as parents of influencer Sophie Evans. The thumbnail showed it all. My parents standing just beyond the yellow tape, my mother clutching Sophie, both of them crying as agents led Ryan away in handcuffs. I stared at the image for a long time, then turned the phone face down on the table. It's only the beginning, I whispered. Ethan looked at me puzzled. What do you mean? I met his gaze, my voice calm and steady. They've spent years building a life on lies. Now the world's about to see exactly who they are. Outside, lightning flashed, painting the sky in white streaks. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain, and for the first time in years, I felt weightless. The storm wasn't mine anymore. The sunlight spilled through the blinds before I even opened my eyes. My phone was already vibrating on the nightstand, buzzing like an angry wasp. At first, I thought it was just one call, maybe two. But when I reached for it, the screen lit up in a blur of notifications, texts, missed calls, voicemails, and a flood of unread messages. 47. I blinked, the sleep clearing from my eyes as the headlines appeared one by one. Influencer's family under investigation after FBI raid. Key Largo shoreline fraud scandal. Bride's family skipped her wedding, now caught in federal case. My family's name, Evans, was everywhere. I sat up slowly, my wedding ring glinting in the light as I scrolled through the chaos. My stomach twisted when I saw the thumbnail of my parents standing behind yellow police tape. My mother's hand clutched over her mouth. Sophie's mascara streaked down her cheeks. Someone had filmed the entire scene. The video had already been shared thousands of times. A caption underneath read, "Karma works fast." Ethan appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You're awake early," he said, handing me one. He glanced at my phone screen, frowned, then let out a quiet sigh. "You've gone viral, love, just not the way they hoped." I couldn't help but laugh, though the sound was bitter. "It's everywhere," I whispered. "They finally got their spotlight." He sat beside me, his tone steady. "And for once, it's not your mess to clean up." The phone buzzed again. This time a voicemail from Aunt Marilyn. I pressed play. "Claire, honey, it's your aunt. Your parents are in real trouble and everyone's talking. You need to call them. The press is calling me now too. Please be the bigger person." Another message followed, my grandmother's voice, this time quivering with judgment. "They made mistakes, sweetheart, but family is family. Don't turn your back on them when they need you." I listened in silence, staring at the steam rising from my coffee. Every word dripped with guilt, with the same old script I'd heard my whole life. Be patient, Claire. Be kind. Be the adult in the room. I deleted both messages without replying. The next one, though, stopped me. It was from my mother. Her voice was small, fragile, almost childlike. "Claire, I don't know what to do. The neighbors are calling, reporters are showing up at the house. Everyone's saying we knew what Ryan was doing. Please, honey, just help us clear our name." I set the phone down. "She still doesn't get it," I murmured. "She thinks this is about saving face, Ethan brushed a hand through my hair. It's always been about appearances with them. Let it crumble. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But there was still a small aching part of me that remembered being a child standing behind the counter in my mother's flower shop, watching her smile for customers, hoping she'd turn and smile at me too. That part of me still flinched at her voice, still wanted to make things right. But the ache was fading. I opened my laptop out of habit, intending to check my work email, but the front page of nearly every news site had the same headline. Sophie's face, perfect filtered crying, stared back at me. Social media star breaks silence after fiancé's arrest. Her statement was short, almost rehearsed. I had no idea what Ryan was involved in. I'm cooperating fully with authorities. My family is devastated. A familiar twist of anger flared in my chest. There it was again, the performance, the shifting of blame, the perfect victim mask. And beneath it, I could already hear my parents' voices defending her. She didn't know, Claire. Don't be cruel. I shut the laptop. By mid-morning, my phone was buzzing again. This time, a number I didn't recognize. I ignored it, then another, then a voicemail notification. Hi, Claire. This is Rachel from Charleston Daily. We'd love a statement from you regarding your family's involvement in the Hale and Partners investigation. How does it feel knowing they missed your wedding for the man now in custody? I laughed under my breath, disbelief curling into something sharper. They really said that. Ethan nodded. You could make a statement. Tell your side. I shook my head. They'll twist it, they always do. No one needs to hear me tear them down. They're doing that on their own. But the calls didn't stop. Each one felt like a ghost knocking at the door. The same refrain over and over. Help them, defend them, explain them. By noon, I was sitting at my desk staring out at the harbor. The water glittered in the sun, calm and endless, as if mocking the chaos unraveling miles away. I thought about all the times I'd been their safety net. When Sophie lost Grandma's bracelet and I got blamed for not watching her. When Mom overdrafted the store account and called me sobbing to fix the books. When Dad asked me to take out a small loan just until next month. Every problem had always been mine to solve, but not anymore. When the phone rang again, I almost didn't pick up. But curiosity won. My mother's voice came through, cracked and trembling. Claire, you have to help us. Please. They froze our accounts. They took our computers, even the car. They're saying we might be charged for tax evasion. You have a good job. You can speak to someone, right? You can fix this. I closed my eyes. Mom, I said quietly. You told me to stay out of family business when I warned you about Ryan. That was different, she snapped, her composure slipping. This isn't just about Sophie anymore. It's about all of us. We're family. No, I said softly. You're Sophie's family. I was never really part of that. Her voice cracked. Claire, don't say that. You're better than this. You've always been the responsible one. I'm not your insurance policy, I said. Not anymore. Then I ended the call. Ethan was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. You okay? I nodded slowly. It feels strange, like cutting off a limb that's already dead. He stepped closer, touching my shoulder. You did what you had to do. That evening I got one last call from Sophie. Her voice was hoarse, shaking. Claire, please. They're saying I might have to testify. Ryan's lawyers are blaming me for everything. The FBI asked about money I didn't even know about. Please help me. You're good with finances, you can explain things. I sat quietly listening to her sob. Once her tears would have broken me. Not anymore. You sound like Mom, I said finally. Still expecting someone else to clean up the mess. Don't be heartless, she cried. You're enjoying this, aren't you? You've always been jealous. Jealous, I repeated, my voice calm. Of being invisible, of watching you take everything that mattered to me. No, Sophie. I'm just relieved that for once the world is seeing who you really are. She gasped a choked sound and then hung up. When I set the phone down, my hands were steady. The apartment was quiet again, the only sound the rain starting up against the window. Ethan sat beside me, flipping through channels until the evening news came on. The anchor's voice filled the room. New developments in the Hale and Partners scandal. Family members of key suspect Ryan Hale expected to be called for questioning. The image changed. My parents walking into a courthouse, faces pale and drawn. My mother clutched Sophie's hand as cameras flashed. Ethan turned to me. "They're in deeper than you thought." I nodded slowly, staring at the screen. It's not about what I thought. It's about what they refused to see. The rain grew heavier outside, washing the streets clean. I stood, turned off the TV, and walked to the window. For the first time, I felt no urge to cry, no impulse to call, no guilt pressing against my chest. "They built their lives on lies," I whispered. "Now they're finally standing in the ruins." Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You're free now, you know." I smiled, faintly resting my head against him. "I know." The phone buzzed one more time on the table. Another headline flashing across the screen: "Bride whose family skipped her wedding speaks out." I reached for it, opened my social media app, and typed one simple post: "Sometimes, love means walking away." Silence was my survival, not my shame. I hit post, set the phone down, and listened to the sound of the rain. For once, the noise outside didn't feel like chaos, it sounded like peace. The newspaper was already creased when I picked it up from the cafe counter, as if someone else had read it before me and couldn't decide whether to pity or gloat. Across the front page in bold letters, my family's name stared back at me. Evans family faces federal hearing in financial misconduct case. I took a slow sip of my coffee, tracing my finger along the photo below the headline. My parents' shoulders hunched walking into the courthouse. My mother's designer sunglasses couldn't hide the hollow look in her face. My father, once proud and commanding, looked smaller, as though the weight of his own denial had finally pressed him into the ground. Beside them, Sophie walked stiffly, her perfect posture gone, her eyes downcast. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. I folded the paper neatly and set it aside. The cafe around me buzzed with soft chatter, the sound of spoons clinking against ceramic. No one paid me any attention, which was exactly how I liked it. I paid my bills, stepped out into the crisp Charleston air, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. As I walked down the street, the memory of all the sorries I'd heard over the years began to rise in my mind, uninvited but familiar. "Sorry, honey, Sophie, didn't mean to break your necklace." "Sorry, sweetheart, we forgot your recital, but we'll go next time." "Sorry, Claire, flights were just too expensive for your graduation." Their apologies were never about remorse. They were resets, tools to smooth over the cracks so they could continue the same behavior without consequence. And now they wanted another one, not to heal but to survive. 2 days later, the email arrived. It was from a law office in Miami. Polite and formal. "Your parents have requested your presence at the upcoming mediation hearing. They believe your statement could help mitigate the penalties." I stared at the screen for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. Ethan noticed. "You don't have to go," he said from across the table. "You owe them nothing." "I know," I said quietly. "But maybe I owe it to myself to hear what they finally have to say." The courthouse in downtown Charleston smelled of dust and disinfectant, like every other building that had seen too many confessions and not enough truth. When I arrived, cameras already crowded the steps. Reporters shouted names, microphones thrust forward, questions slicing through the cold morning air. I slipped through the side entrance unnoticed. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly. My parents were already there, seated beside their lawyer. My mother's hands trembled as she straightened her jacket, while my father leaned forward with a forced air of dignity. Sophie sat between them, pale and silent, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't look up when I entered. My mother's eyes widened. "You came?" she whispered, voice fragile. I nodded. "To listen." The mediation began. Their lawyer cleared his throat and launched into a practice speech about unfortunate misunderstandings, misguided trust, and family unity. My parents nodded solemnly as though they were the victims of their own story. When the lawyer finished, my father spoke. "Claire, we didn't know what Ryan was doing. He told us it was legitimate. We just wanted to help him to support Sophie's future." My mother clasped her hands dramatically. "Everything we did was for your sister's happiness. You have to understand that, sweetheart." For a long moment I said nothing. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Finally, I looked at them both and said, "You didn't trust him. You chose him. Just like you always chose her." My father blinked, startled. My mother's lips parted as if to protest, but I kept going. "Every time you could have shown me love, you chose convenience instead. You chose appearances. You chose Sophie. And now you're not asking for forgiveness because you're sorry. You're asking because you're scared." The words hung in the air like a verdict. My mother broke first. "We're family, Claire," she whispered. "You can't just walk away." "I already did," I said softly. "The day you skipped my wedding." Her tears fell quickly, then real or not I couldn't tell. My father's jaw tightened, his pride unraveling under the weight of my calm. "After all we did for you," I cut him off. "After all I did for you, you mean?" The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we could, refocus. Miss Evans, would you consider issuing a public statement of support? It might help ease the public perception." I smiled politely. "You mean help polish the illusion?" "No, thank you. I think the truth looks better without makeup." Sophie's eyes finally met mine. They were red, glassy, filled with something I hadn't seen in her before: fear. She stood up suddenly, her voice shaking. "Please don't leave. Don't let it end like this. I can't do this without you." I turned toward her, my voice gentle but firm. "Then maybe it's time you find out who you are without me." She grabbed my wrist, desperate, but I pulled away. When I looked at her, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt pity, the kind that comes when you realize someone has built their life entirely on other people's validation. The lawyer announced a recess. I stood smoothing my coat and walked toward the exit. My mother reached out as I passed her, whispering, "Please, Claire, help us." I paused just long enough to meet her eyes. "Mom, you taught me that love meant sacrifice. But I finally learned that real love doesn't ask one person to burn so everyone else can stay warm." Outside, the cold hit my face like a clean slate. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices overlapping in a storm of questions. "Claire, will you forgive your family, Claire? Do you blame your sister?" I stopped halfway down the stairs, the marble beneath my heels slick from rain. I turned just enough for my voice to carry over the crowd. "Forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the people who broke you. It means releasing their power over you." For a moment there was silence. Then the clicking of cameras began again. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the rain had begun to fall, soft, cleansing, almost tender. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking, each step lighter than the last. That evening, I sat on the balcony of our apartment, the harbor stretching out in front of me like a quiet promise. The sky was painted in shades of coral and violet. Ethan brought out 2 glasses of wine, setting one beside me. "You didn't say much when you got home," he said. "There wasn't much left to say," I answered. "They said sorry again." He looked at me. "And did it help?" I smiled faintly, swirling the wine in my glass. "No, but it doesn't hurt anymore either." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the seagulls cry over the water. The light from the setting sun caught my wedding ring, reflecting a shimmer onto my hand. I thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the betrayals, the endless cycle of forgiveness that was never real. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like history. "It's strange," I said softly. "All my life I wanted their apology. But now that I've heard it, I feel nothing." Ethan smiled, resting his hand over mine. "That's how you know you've healed." I turned to him, eyes on the horizon. "No," I said. "That's how I know I'm free." My phone buzzed again, but I didn't reach for it. When I finally did, it was an email from a journalist, a woman whose podcast I'd listened to for years. The subject line read, "Your story has inspired thousands of women." She wanted to interview me about resilience, about boundaries, about rebuilding your sense of worth after betrayal. I closed the laptop and leaned back, the cool evening air brushing my face. Maybe it was time the right story got told. The one where silence wasn't weakness. The one where walking away was the truest act of love. The email had been sitting in my inbox for a week before I finally opened it. Every time I saw the subject line, "Your story has inspired thousands of women," I scrolled past it, pretending I wasn't curious. But that morning, the light over Charleston was soft and golden, and for some reason, I felt brave enough to face it. The message was from Emily Carter, a journalist and podcast host I'd admired for years. She'd written, "Your story has struck a chord. I'd be honored to feature you on my show, Breaking the Silence." The invitation felt surreal. For most of my life, I'd been the quiet one, the invisible one. Now someone wanted to hear my voice. Ethan noticed me reading it over breakfast. "You should do it," he said, pouring coffee into my mug. "I don't know," I admitted. "What if it sounds like revenge? I don't want to be that woman who airs dirty laundry." He smiled. "You're not getting revenge, Claire. You're reclaiming your story. There's a difference." I looked at him for a long moment and nodded. "Then I'll do it." For the next few days, I filled pages of my journal with notes, memories I'd avoided for years, the moments that shaped me, the lessons I'd learned the hard way. It was painful revisiting old ghosts. The night before the recording, I found the wedding invitation I'd mailed to my parents still tucked in a drawer. I ran my fingers over their names, printed in gold, and whispered, "You had your chance to show up." Then I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and slid it into the back of my closet where it belonged. When the day came, the recording studio was smaller than I'd imagined. Soft lights, pale gray walls, a single microphone between two chairs. Emily greeted me warmly, her handshake firm but kind. "Thank you for coming," she said. "This episode means a lot to me personally. It's called Daughters Who Choose Themselves." I smiled faintly. I think I've been trying to do that my whole life. Once the recording started, Emily leaned forward and asked the first question. "Why, now? Why choose to speak after staying silent for so long?" I took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Because I spent too many years waiting for permission to exist. My family taught me that my feelings didn't matter, that being the quiet one made me strong. But silence isn't strength. It's survival. And I don't want to just survive anymore." Emily nodded gently. "Can you tell us about the day that changed everything?" I hesitated, then began to speak, the words spilling out like they'd been waiting behind a locked door. I told her about the wedding, the empty seats, the phone calls, and the message that shattered my illusion of family. I described how it felt to see my parents' faces on the news, not as proud parents, but as people finally facing the truth. "It wasn't about karma," I said softly. "It was consequence. They built their lives around pretending, and eventually the lie broke under its own weight." Emily sat in silence, eyes glistening. "How did you find peace after something like that?" I smiled, though it felt more like an exhale. "By realizing I didn't need their apology. I spent my life chasing their approval, thinking that if I worked hard enough, they'd love me the way I loved them. But forgiveness isn't about letting them back in. It's about letting myself move forward without them." The studio was quiet for a moment. Even the producer behind the glass looked like she was holding her breath. Then Emily said, "That's beautiful. Did you ever want to get revenge?" "Of course I did," I said with a small laugh. "For a long time I thought revenge meant proving them wrong, making them see what they lost. But now I know the real revenge is living well, building a life that doesn't depend on them seeing it." When the interview ended, Emily hugged me. "You have no idea how many people will need to hear this." I walked out of the studio into a warm Charleston afternoon sunlight, brushing against the water. I felt lighter, like I'd set something down I'd been carrying my entire life. A week later, the episode aired. That morning, I woke up to hundreds of messages on my phone, emails, comments, private notes from strangers. Some were from young women just starting their lives. Others from mothers, grandmothers, Even widows who said my story made them feel seen. One message read, "You told my story. I didn't think anyone else understood." Another said, "My daughter and I listened together. I think we both cried." I sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through the words of strangers who somehow felt like sisters. For years I'd begged my own family to see me. Now thousands of people did, and not because I demanded it, but because I finally spoke. Ethan came in holding 2 mugs of tea. "You've been reading since sunrise," he teased. I smiled, handing him the phone. "Listen to this one." I read a message aloud. "You reminded me that walking away doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing peace." He smiled. "Sounds like someone finally found her purpose." The podcast went viral within a day. Emily's inbox overflowed with listener letters and she called to thank me. "You've started something bigger than a story, Claire. You've started a conversation." Meanwhile, my parents remained silent. No calls, no emails, no apologies. And for the first time, I didn't need one. Their silence no longer felt like rejection, it felt like accountability. I began to write again small essays about resilience and boundaries. One piece I titled, "When the Apology Never Comes." I published it anonymously online, but its spread quickly shared across women's forums and support groups. A week later, Emily called again. "There's a women's conference next month," she said. "They want you to speak. The theme is reclaiming your voice." At first I laughed. "I'm not a speaker. I just told one story." She smiled through the phone. "Exactly, and that's what makes it real." The day of the conference, I stood backstage, heart pounding. The crowd was mostly women my mother's age, strong, tired, hopeful faces. I thought of all the years I'd tried to be good enough for one woman who couldn't see me. Now I was here because hundreds of women had. When it was my turn, I stepped onto the stage, the lights soft and golden. The audience quieted. I took a deep breath and began. For most of my life, I said I thought love meant staying quiet, keeping peace, no matter how much it cost me. But I learned that silence doesn't protect love, it buries it. We spend so much time trying to be seen by others when freedom begins the moment we see ourselves clearly. I told them about boundaries, about letting go without bitterness. I told them how it felt to finally stop apologizing for existing. And when I finished, the room stood in applause, not loud or frenzied, but warm, sustained like an embrace. Later that evening, Ethan and I walked along the harbor. The air was cool, the sunset bleeding orange into blue. I looked at the water and said, "For so long I thought my story ended when they stopped loving me. But it turns out that's where it began." He smiled, sliding his arm around me. "You didn't lose a family, Claire. You found yourself." I nodded, my throat tight. And maybe that's the only kind of revenge that really heals. That night, as I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed again. Another email, this one from a listener named Margaret. She wrote, "My daughter and I listened to your episode together. I called her afterward to apologize for all the times I made her feel small. You reminded me it's never too late to be a better mother." I read it twice, tears stinging my eyes. Then I closed the phone and whispered to myself, maybe that's what healing sounds like. Outside, the tide rolled in against the Charleston shore, soft and steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to call. I already had everything I needed: the peace that comes when you finally tell your own story, and the strength that comes when you no longer have to prove you were worth hearing. The mornings in Charleston had grown quieter lately. I'd stopped waking up to chaos. No phone buzzing, no news alerts about my family, no anxious thoughts clawing at the edge of my sleep. The stillness felt new, strange even. Peace, I realized, was something you had to learn how to live with after a lifetime of noise. I poured my coffee, opened the kitchen window, and let the cool salt air drift in from the harbor. The light spilling across the counter made everything look softer, the same apartment, the same city, but lighter somehow. For years I had thought peace meant waiting for apologies, for closure, for someone else to fix what was broken. Now I knew peace was simply the sound of your own breath when no one else could control it. The letter arrived just after noon. A plain white envelope, no return address. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, but familiar. I stared at it for a while, unsure whether to open it. The last thing I wanted was another plea for help, another manipulation wrapped in sentimental ink. But something told me this was different. I slid my finger along the edge and unfolded the paper. Claire, I don't know where to start. I don't expect you to answer me. I just need to say this somewhere. I've been living in a small rental by the beach. I lost the apartment, the followers, the money, everything. I thought my world ended when Ryan was arrested, but now I think maybe it's just beginning in a strange way. I used to believe you hated me because you were jealous. But now I see you had something I never did: integrity. You lived honestly even when no one cared to see you. I wish I'd learned that from you sooner. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know I'm sorry. The letter ended without a signature, just a shaky line under the word sorry. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. My heart didn't twist with anger the way it once would have. It felt quiet. There was sadness, but not bitterness. Maybe because I finally understood that this apology wasn't for me, it was Sophie trying to make peace with herself. Still, her words lingered in my mind all afternoon. That evening, I decided to take a walk through the old part of town. My steps led me down King Street past the boutique windows and brick storefronts until I stopped in front of a place I hadn't visited in years. Evan's Florist. My mother's old shop. The sign was faded now, the letters peeling the display window covered in a layer of dust. A for-lease poster hung crookedly across the glass. Inside, I could still picture the rows of buckets filled with lilies and roses, the smell of cut stems and soil. The faint sound of my mother's laughter, always loudest when it wasn't directed at me. I stood there for a long time, remembering the little girl who used to sweep the floor after school, who tied ribbons around bouquets, hoping one day her mother might say, "You did that beautifully." She never did. I bent down, picked a single white rose from the bouquet I'd bought earlier, and laid it gently against the door. It wasn't for them, it was for her. The version of me who spent years trying to bloom in the shade. That night over dinner, I told Ethan about Sophie's letter. He listened quietly, setting his fork down when I finished. "Will you write her back?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm not angry anymore. But I'm not ready to open that door again either." He nodded, his gaze steady and kind. Forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door, Claire. Sometimes it just means you stop standing guard outside it. I smiled at that because it was exactly what I needed to hear. Later, after he went to bed, I sat on the balcony with my journal, the night air warm and still. I began to write, not for Sophie, not for my parents, but for myself. Forgiveness isn't something you give because someone deserves it. It's something you choose when you're tired of carrying pain that no longer belongs to you. I paused, then wrote another line. They taught me silence was strength, but I've learned that peace is. The next morning I pulled out a piece of stationery and began to write back. "Dear Sophie, I don't hate you. I hope you find peace. But I'm choosing distance. We both need to grow, just not together. That's not cruelty, it's clarity. Take care of yourself. Claire." It wasn't a long letter, and it didn't need to be. There was nothing more to explain. I sealed it, slipped it into an envelope, and walked it down to the mailbox on the corner. As the envelope slid through the slot, a small wave of relief passed through me. For the first time in years, my hands didn't shake when I let go. On my way home, I passed a newspaper stand. The front page caught my eye. Former Hale and Partners investors sentenced to probation. Below the headline was a photo of my parents leaving the courthouse. My father's shoulders were stooped. My mother's once perfect hair now streaked with gray. They looked older, tired, but strangely calm. Maybe they'd finally stopped pretending. I stood there for a moment, the newspaper fluttering in the breeze. I didn't feel anger or satisfaction, just distance. The kind that doesn't ache anymore. They finally learned what consequence feels like, I thought. And I finally learned what peace does. That weekend, Ethan and I drove down to Folly Beach. The sky was clear, the waves rolling in steady and patient. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. We walked along the shoreline until the sounds of the crowd faded behind us. I slipped off my sandals and let the water wash over my feet, cool and familiar. The horizon stretched endlessly before me, and for a long moment I just stood there breathing it in. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I forgive you, all of you." The words weren't heavy. They didn't burn or break me. They just drifted into the wind, carried away like sea foam. Ethan came up beside me, sliding his arm around my shoulders. "What did you just say?" he asked. "Nothing," I said softly, "just letting go." We stayed like that for a while, watching the waves erase our footprints. The sun dipped lower, painting the water in gold. "Maybe forgiveness isn't saying they were right," I said quietly. "Maybe it's just saying I'm free." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "You've been free for a while now. You just finally noticed." When we left the beach that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. As we drove back into the city, the radio played softly. Halfway across the bridge, a familiar voice came through the speakers, Emily Carter's podcast. It was a rerun of my episode. I listened to my own words echo back through the car. Forgiveness isn't letting them back in. It's walking forward without looking back. I glanced out the window at the Charleston skyline glowing against the dusk, the water shimmering below us. My reflection in the glass looked peaceful, steady, whole. "Exactly," I whispered. Ethan glanced over, smiling. "What was that?" "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "Just agreeing with someone I finally understand." The night fell around us, soft and forgiving. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was escaping my past. I was simply living beyond it. The rain had been falling since morning, steady and unhurried, like the world was rinsing itself clean. I sat at my desk by the window, the soft rhythm of the drops blending with the faint hum of the ceiling fan. My life had finally found its rhythm, too quiet, deliberate, predictable in the best way. The consulting work kept me busy, my evenings were peaceful, and my heart was still. I'd learned to love the silence that once terrified me. When you've spent most of your life fighting storms, the calm can feel almost foreign, like a house that's too quiet after years of chaos. But I was learning to trust it. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. I assumed it was a delivery. Ethan had ordered new patio chairs, but when I opened the door, the world tilted just a little. Sophie stood there. For a second, neither of us spoke. The rain streaked down behind her, framing her like some ghost from another life. Her once perfect blonde hair hung limp around her face, and the sparkle she used to wear like armor was gone. She looked smaller, thinner, fragile in a way I'd never seen. "I didn't know where else to go," she said finally. Her voice cracked on the last word. "I didn't move. You could have called. I was afraid you wouldn't answer." She wasn't wrong. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the couch. "Come in." She walked slowly, glancing around like she was afraid to disturb anything. When she sank into the couch, she clasped her hands tightly in her lap, eyes darting toward the window. "You look different," I said quietly. "I feel different." The silence stretched between us, the kind of silence that carried years of things left unsaid. I went to the kitchen, poured her a glass of water, and set it on the coffee table. She smiled faintly. "Thanks." For a moment, I didn't know where to begin. The last time I'd seen her, she'd been living a life of champagne and camera flashes, bragging about sponsorship deals and travel plans. Now the woman in front of me looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I saw the podcast," she said softly. "I listened to all of it. Twice. That surprised me. And I cried," she admitted. "Not because of what you said about me, but because of how much I didn't see until now. You were always trying to keep the family together, and I kept breaking it apart." Her words landed heavy, but not sharp. The anger that used to rise so easily inside me didn't come this time. I only felt a quiet ache. She went on, "I've been trying to get my life together. It's harder than I thought. Nobody wants to hire a woman known for being part of a scandal. I'm staying in a rental near Clearwater, working part-time at a community center." I nodded, watching the rain streak down the glass. "That sounds good." "Grounded." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Yeah, you could say that. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small box, placing it carefully on the table between us. I brought you something. Inside were old photographs, faded prints from our childhood. Me holding a bouquet in front of Mom's flower shop. Sophie sitting on the counter, grinning, with a crown of daisies in her hair. One of us both side by side, sunlight spilling through the shop window. Mom kept these, she said softly. I thought you should have them. I stared at the photos, my throat tightening. Pictures don't change what happened. No, she said quietly. But maybe they remind us who we were before everything went wrong. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the room. Do you ever think about her? Sophie asked after a while. About Mom, all the time, I admitted. Not because I miss her the way I should, but because I still wish things had been different. Sophie nodded. She wasn't easy to love. Neither were we. She looked at me then, and for the first time in years, I saw the little sister I used to protect the one who used to crawl into my bed when thunderstorms scared her. I came here to tell you something, she said finally. I don't expect you to forgive me. Then why come? She hesitated, twisting her hands together. Because I wanted to thank you for walking away. If you hadn't, I never would have realized what losing you really meant. I studied her face, the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. You didn't lose me, Sophie. You just lost access to the version of me who accepted everything. Her lip trembled. I'm proud of you, you know. You did what I never could. What's that? You got out. I didn't know how to respond to that. The only sound was the rain drumming softly against the window, steady and relentless. I'm trying, Claire, she whispered. I'm not asking you to forget. I just wanted to say I'm sorry in person this time. I'm trying to be better. For a long moment I said nothing. I simply watched her, the girl who had once been the center of my family's world, now sitting small and broken in my living room. Finally I stood. Come here. She looked up startled, then slowly rose to her feet. I stepped forward and pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened at first, then melted into it, her arms wrapping around me. The tears came quickly, quiet and real. When we pulled apart, I saw the relief in her face, like she'd been holding her breath for years. I'm not asking you to call me, she said, her voice soft. I just wanted you to know I'm trying. I nodded. Then keep trying. As I walked her to the door, she paused on the threshold, the rain still falling outside. You were always the strong one, she said. No, I replied gently. I just learned how to stop breaking for other people. She smiled through her tears and stepped out into the rain, raising her umbrella as she disappeared down the street. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, watching the raindrops trace long silver lines across the glass. Something inside me loosened, a quiet exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't arrive like a lightning strike. It seeps in slowly through the cracks until one day you realize the anger has softened into understanding. That night, Ethan came home to find me sitting by the window, a photo from the box resting in my hands. It was the one of me and Sophie outside the flower shop, both of us laughing, sun in our eyes. Everything okay? He asked. She came by, I said. He studied me for a moment. And how do you feel? Lighter, I said. Like something I'd been carrying finally set itself down. He smiled, wrapping an arm around me. You really did it. You broke the cycle. No, I said softly. I just stopped spinning. We sat in silence for a while, watching the rain ease into mist. The clouds began to thin, revealing streaks of pale sunlight breaking through. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the air was clean and cool, the city alive again. Boats moved lazily across the harbor, and children's laughter echoed from somewhere nearby. For a long time I just stood there, letting the sun warm my face. Maybe peace, I thought, isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about remembering differently. And for the first time, the past didn't feel like a shadow behind me. It felt like a road I'd already walked, one that led me exactly where I was meant to be. A year can change everything. Spring light spilled through the curtains of my Charleston apartment, soft and golden, painting the room in quiet warmth. The city outside hummed with gentle life seagulls, circling over the harbor, the faint clink of cafe cups down the street, the sound of people who were living, not rushing. My mornings used to begin with dread, with messages that felt like landmines. Now they began with peace. I sat at my desk, coffee steaming beside a vase of fresh tulips. The walls around me told the story of the woman I'd become, framed photos from my travels, handwritten notes from clients, a certificate for the nonprofit I'd helped found. No photos of my parents, no reminders of what I'd lost, only proof of what I'd built. It had been 1 year since Sophie showed up on my doorstep. 1 year since I'd finally let the past stop defining who I was. Life hadn't turned into a fairy tale, but it had become mine, steady and perfect, free. They say time heals all wounds. That's not true. Time doesn't heal. It just gives you space to rebuild yourself around the scar. I finished writing a report for a client and closed my laptop. My business, a small financial consulting agency for women starting over, had grown faster than I ever expected. The women who came to me carried stories like my own betrayal, loss, starting from nothing. Helping them plan their finances felt less like work and more like redemption. Sometimes late at night, I'd look over the list of clients, teachers, nurses, single mothers, women in their 60s, starting new lives after decades of silence. And I'd think, this is what it means to turn pain into purpose. Emily Carter, the journalist who had once interviewed me, had become one of my closest friends. Together, we launched a mentorship program called Start Again, pairing women in crisis with financial and emotional support. The tagline we chose still made me smile whenever I saw it on the website, because beginning again is not failure. It's proof you survived. A gentle breeze came through the window, carrying the scent of the harbor. I turned toward the sunlight and thought of Sophie. Every few months, she sent a postcard from Florida, short, simple messages written in her neat, careful handwriting. I'm volunteering at a shelter now. I'm taking a photography class. Thank you for showing me how to start over. I never wrote back, but I kept them all in a small wooden box beside my desk. Forgiveness didn't mean reunion. It meant peace without the noise. As for my parents, there had been nothing but silence. I used to check the news or public records, wondering if something had happened, but eventually I stopped. The ache that used to accompany their absence had softened into something quieter, a kind of understanding. Not all love survives exposure to truth. Some just dissolves into distance. That afternoon, I was scheduled to speak at a women's conference downtown. I slipped on a soft beige dress, simple earrings, nothing extravagant. The woman in the mirror was unrecognizable from the one who had once stood in front of an empty aisle on her wedding day. Her eyes weren't haunted anymore. They were steady, clear. The ballroom was full when I arrived, hundreds of women from across the country. Emily greeted me backstage, her eyes sparkling. "They're ready for you," she said. I smiled. So am I. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause was gentle but warm. I took a breath and looked out at the sea of faces. So many stories, so many second chances. For most of my life I thought survival meant staying quiet. I believed that being strong meant holding everything inside and smiling through the pain. But I was wrong. Strength isn't silence. It's choosing to speak when you were taught to stay small. The room was silent. I told them about rebuilding after loss, about learning to live for myself, about the day I stopped chasing apologies. I spoke not from anger but from calm, because the woman who had once been erased was now fully present. When I finished, the audience rose to their feet. But it wasn't the applause that made me emotional. It was the sight of one woman in the front row, about 60, wiping tears from her eyes. Later, she approached me, her voice trembling. "My daughter and I haven't spoken in 10 years, she said. "Your story made me realize it's not too late to try." I hugged her. "It's never too late," I whispered. That night, Ethan surprised me with dinner by the harbor. The restaurant overlooked the water's soft jazz floating through the air. He reached across the table, taking my hand. "You've built something beautiful, Claire," he said. "You know that, right?" I smiled. "It's taken me a while to believe that." He pulled a small box from his pocket and slid it toward me. My breath caught, but when I opened it, there wasn't a ring inside. There was a silver compass gleaming softly under the light. "Because you've always known where to go," he said quietly. "You just needed to trust yourself to lead." I laughed, blinking back tears. "No vows, no diamonds," he grinned. "No cages, no expectations. Just us." We clinked glasses, the sound mingling with the laughter from nearby tables. I didn't need a wedding to feel whole. Love wasn't something that completed me. It was something that met me where I already stood. A week later, I received a letter from the attorney handling my late grandmother's estate. A small inheritance had finally cleared, nothing life-changing, but enough to make me pause. That night, I wrote a check and enclosed a note. For the women who were told to stay quiet, use it to help them speak again. Then, I mailed it to the foundation. The next morning, as the envelope disappeared into the blue mailbox, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Some legacies aren't about money. They're about rewriting the story of what strength looks like. At the end of spring, Emily and I hosted our first Start Again gala. The ballroom glowed with soft light tables decorated with white roses and gold ribbons. Women laughed, shared stories, embraced. Emily took the stage and smiled toward me. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate the woman who taught us that silence can be broken with grace. Claire Evans, thank you for showing us that survival can look like peace." The applause was overwhelming. I looked around the room, so many faces, so much life, and I realized something profound. They had missed my wedding, but they couldn't miss my becoming. Later that night back home, I stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Her eyes were soft, her posture strong. I thought about everything I had lost, and how every loss had cleared space for something truer. The life I wanted, I whispered, was never about being chosen. It was about choosing myself. The next morning, the sky broke open into color. Ethan and I walked down to the harbor as the first light shimmered across the water. The air was cool, the waves gentle, the city still, half asleep. I slipped off my shoes and let the sand press against my feet. The tide moved in slow and steady, just like my heart now. "They say forgiveness is a gift you give to others," I murmured, watching the horizon. "But I think it's the one you keep for yourself." Ethan slid his arm around my waist. "You've earned every bit of this peace," he said. I smiled. "No, I built it." The sun climbed higher, turning the water gold. I stood there a moment longer, breathing in the scent of salt and new beginnings. The life I had now wasn't the one they had imagined for me. It wasn't perfect or loud or filled with grand gestures, but it was mine, every quiet, deliberate piece of it. And as the light spread across the harbor, I knew one thing for certain. I had forgiven, I had healed, and I had finally come home to myself. The morning started like any other. Sunlight poured over the balcony garden, glinting off the small glass jars of basil and rosemary I'd planted last spring. The air was cool, and Charleston moved lazily below the city, still half asleep. I was trimming a sprig of mint for my tea when my phone began to ring. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, Georgia area code. I almost ignored it, but something in me hesitated. When I answered, a soft voice came through the line. "Miss Evans, my name's Marla. I'm a nurse at St. Augustine Hospice in Savannah. I'm calling about your mother." For a moment I couldn't speak. The sound of seagulls and the faint hum of traffic blurred into a single ringing silence. "She's been with us for a few weeks," Marla continued gently. "She asked for you this morning. She said you might not come, but she wanted me to call anyway." My fingers tightened around the phone. "How bad is it?" "She's weak but lucid. She doesn't have much time left." I closed my eyes. "Thank you for letting me know." After I hung up, I stood on the balcony for a long time, the tea cooling beside me. The city sounds came back into focus, children laughing, waves breaking faintly in the distance. The world was still moving forward. Only, I felt, suddenly still. That evening, Ethan found me sitting on the porch staring at the horizon. I told him about the call. "I don't know if I should go," I admitted. I already forgave her. Seeing her won't change that. He leaned against the railing beside me, the orange dusk washing across his face. Maybe it's not about changing the past, he said softly. Maybe it's about changing the ending. His words stayed with me. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag and drove south. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lined with pine trees and spring wildflowers. The farther I went, the quieter the world seemed. I turned off the radio and let the silence speak. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who begged for approval, who built her worth around being good enough to be noticed. I thought about the woman I'd become, the one who learned that love doesn't have to be earned. Maybe I thought this wasn't a trip for her. Maybe it was for me. When I arrived at the hospice, the air smelled faintly of lavender and rain. A nurse led me down a quiet hallway to a sunlit room at the end. She lay there, frail and small, beneath a white blanket. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was now thin and gray, but her eyes, when they opened, still held the sharpness I remembered. "You came," she whispered. I nodded, stepping closer to her bedside. "You asked for me? So I came." A faint smile crossed her lips. "You look strong." "I am," I said simply. The nurse adjusted the blanket and slipped out, leaving us alone. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of a radio playing old jazz. Finally, she said, "I don't know how to start. I've made so many mistakes." I stayed silent, letting her speak. "I thought love was something you had to earn," she continued. "And I thought if I kept everything perfect, no one could see how afraid I was. I wanted to be proud of you, but I didn't know how to love you without feeling small next to you. You were always so capable." Her voice broke. "I failed you. I failed both of you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, though my voice stayed calm. "You did what you knew. I stopped needing your apology a long time ago." Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes glistening. "Then why did you come?" I took her hand, the skin paper, thin and cold against my palm. "Because I wanted you to know I turned out okay. Despite everything." She looked at me for a long moment, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You were always my light, Claire. I just didn't know how to love the light." My throat tightened. "It's okay, Mom. You can rest now." Her hand squeezed mine once, then loosened. The rise and fall of her chest slowed until it stopped completely. The room seemed to exhale with her. For a moment, I just sat there, holding her hand, watching the sunlight shift across the wall. There was no grand emotion, no collapse, no rage, just quiet release, the kind that feels like an ending and a beginning at the same time. 3 days later, Sophie and I stood side by side at a small memorial service. The church was nearly empty, just us, a few hospice staff, and the pastor. Sophie looked different now, steady, grounded. When she saw me, she gave a small, sad smile. "She talked about you," she said softly. "All the time. Said you found peace." I think that gave her peace too. I nodded. "Then maybe we're all finally done fighting." Sophie reached out her hand, brushing mine briefly. Then she stepped forward and placed a single white rose on the casket. I followed, laying another beside it. After the service, we stood in the parking lot for a while, watching the clouds drift over the Georgia sky. "I'm staying here for a bit," Sophie said, volunteering at the hospice. "I think I need to." "That sounds good," I said. "You'll help people who need it." She smiled faintly. "You sound like Mom." We both laughed, a quiet, bittersweet sound. Then we said our goodbyes, no promises, no expectations, just peace. Back in Charleston, the city greeted me with the scent of salt and rain. That evening, I walked to the harbor with a small tin in my hands. Inside were a few of my mother's ashes. The wind was soft as I stepped onto the pier. I opened the tin and let the ashes scatter over the water, the tide carrying them away. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," I whispered. "It's about remembering without pain." The sky turned gold, and for a moment, it felt like everything, every heartbreak, every silence, every empty chair had led exactly here. Weeks later, I stood before a room full of women at our foundation's mentorship luncheon. Their faces glowed with quiet hope, each of them carrying their own stories of survival. "We don't heal because they apologize," I told them. "We heal because we stop needing them to." Applause filled the room, soft but sincere. I smiled, thinking of my mother, of Sophie, of the girl I used to be. That night on the balcony, the city lights shimmered over the water. Ethan joined me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "It's over," I said quietly. He kissed my temple. "No," he whispered. "It's begun." The harbor below was calm, the moonlight spilling over the waves. I closed my eyes and breathed in the salt air, the sound of the tide like a heartbeat. I used to think revenge meant making them feel my pain. But standing there with peace finally in my chest, I knew better. The greatest revenge is living in a calm they can no longer disturb, and I had finally found mine. The morning sun rose slow and soft over the Charleston harbor, turning the water the color of honey. I sat on my balcony, my journal open in front of me, the same one I'd carried through the hardest years of my life. The pages were full now, some stained with tears, others smudged with coffee, all written by a woman who had finally found her way back to herself. It had been a year since my mother's passing, a year since I stood by the harbor and let the last of her ashes scatter into the wind. I still came out here most mornings with my tea and my thoughts. Not because I was haunted, but because I liked to remember from a place of peace. A year ago, I said goodbye to the woman who broke me and to the woman I used to be. Life had changed quietly since then. The Start Again Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. What began as a small support group now stretched across the state, workshops in libraries, shelters, and community colleges, helping women rebuild their lives after betrayal, divorce, or loss. Women who once whispered their pain now spoke with strength, and every time I heard their laughter in those rooms, it felt like healing, echoing through time. The voice they once silenced now helped others speak. That morning, as I finished writing a few notes for a meeting, a knock sounded at the door. When I opened it, Emily Carter stood there with her usual bright grin and a paper bag of croissants. "Breakfast and business," she said, walking in before I could answer. We sat at the table, sunlight spilling across our coffee cups. Emily pulled a folder from her bag. "You're going to want to see this." Inside was a letter from a publishing house in New York. They wanted to adapt my podcast episode and speeches into a book, a memoir about healing, forgiveness, and starting over. I stared at it for a long moment. "Emily, I never wanted fame." She smiled gently. "Then don't write it for fame. Write it for the woman you used to be. The one who needed to know peace was possible." That night, I sat at my desk, long after Ethan had gone to bed. Outside, the city was quiet except for the hum of distant traffic and the soft rush of the tide. I began to write, not about the scandal, not about the family that forgot me, but about what came after. I wrote about rebuilding, about silence that healed instead of hurt, about finding love that didn't demand sacrifice. And as the words poured out, I realized I wasn't just writing my story anymore. I was writing a map for anyone who'd ever felt erased. For years I wrote, I waited for my family to write me into their story. Now I'm writing my own. It took months to finish. There were nights I cried, nights I laughed at old memories, and nights I simply sat in awe at how far I'd come. When the book was finally published, we held the launch in a small independent bookstore downtown. The sign outside read, "The Life One Chose, a Conversation with Claire Evans." The room was full, women from every walk of life, from college students to grandmothers. I could see Emily in the corner, beaming like a proud sister. But what caught my breath was a familiar face near the back, Sophie. She looked nervous, but there was a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. I gave a small nod, and she smiled almost shyly. When it was my turn to speak, I opened to the final page of my book. "I used to believe my story ended the day my family walked away," I read. But I was wrong. It began the day I stopped waiting for them to come back. The room was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with gentle applause. Afterward, Sophie approached me. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then she reached out and hugged me. "You did it," she whispered. "So did you," I replied. We didn't promise to see each other again soon. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Peace doesn't always need words, it just needs truth. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to record a follow-up interview for her podcast exactly 1 year after the first episode that had changed everything. As we sat across from each other in the recording studio, she smiled. "So Claire," she said, "if you could talk to the woman you were 5 years ago, what would you tell her?" I laughed softly. "I'd tell her she doesn't need to be chosen to be worthy. She already is." Emily nodded. "And what do you want your story to leave behind?" I thought for a moment. "Hope," I said. "For every woman who's ever been forgotten or silenced to know she can start again." When the episode aired, messages poured in from women around the country. Some were simple thank yous. Others were long confessions about broken families, lost marriages, and the courage to begin again. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me the strength to leave. I didn't think I could start over at 58. But now I know I can." Another wrote, "I played your podcast for my daughter. We cried together. Thank you for helping us find each other again." Reading those messages felt like watching a wave move through generations, each voice carrying the next one forward. Emily called one night, laughing through tears. "You've started a movement, Claire. Peace is the loudest, revenge is trending everywhere." I smiled at that. "Maybe it's not revenge," I said. "Maybe it's remembrance, the kind that sets you free." A few months later, the foundation hosted its annual gala. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight and laughter. Women who once walked in timid now danced barefoot to live jazz. Emily handed me a microphone near the end of the night. "This," she said to the crowd, "is the woman who taught us that strength can be quiet and that peace can roar louder than pain." I looked out at them, my heart full. "They missed my wedding," I said, smiling, "but they couldn't miss my becoming." The room erupted in applause, but this time I didn't feel like I was performing. I was simply living. Later that night back home, I sat by the window and wrote one last letter to the girl I used to be. "Dear Claire, you did it. You survived every silence, every heartbreak, every empty chair. You learned that the world doesn't need to see you to make you real. You walked away from what broke you, and you didn't harden, you bloomed. And someday, another woman will read your story and see herself in your words. That's your legacy." I folded the letter and slipped it into a copy of my book, then placed it on the free reads shelf at the local library. Somewhere, someday, another woman would find it. The next morning, I walked along the harbor as the first light spread across the water. The sky was pink and gold, the tide whispering softly against the shore. I stopped to watch the sunrise the same way I had done so many times before. But today, it felt different. It wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost, it was a celebration of everything I'd found. In the end, my story wasn't about revenge. It was about return to myself, to peace, to the life I was always meant to live. They say time heals all wounds. Maybe not. But it teaches you which ones were never yours to carry. And as the sun lifted higher over Charleston, I smiled barefoot in the sand, finally free.